Okay, if we could have the first slide, please. The first thing to say is that radiation is an established threat to health, and therefore it's one that we cannot detect with our own senses. We need instruments to do it. And it's therefore not surprising that radiation generates fear in those who have been exposed or believe that they have been exposed. And this is okay, fear, we can call it worry, it doesn't really matter, it's much the same thing. And this fear or worry generates stress, which causes physiological changes. And I think probably everybody has experienced a sensation, a tingling of the spine, or being made to jump if there is a loud bang that they don't expect. These are physiological responses of something which is essentially a mental problem. So we have come to, well, if this fear or worry persists over a long period, I mean, it's very useful as a very rapid response to a situation, but if it continues and is not resolved, then it can actually lead to physiological effects. So we've come to understand this phenomenon really since the Chernobyl accident, and it is actually a natural response to worry or stress or fear. Yeah. So the issue is that if we could remove that, we could resolve those stresses and worries at the outset, then there would be no psychosocial effect. It is, in fact, removable. It's a result of a long-term problem of maintaining stress. And as I said, the Chernobyl accident was a kind of milestone in this subject. And a professor of psychology and with a particular interest in stress, Leonard Levy, visited Chernobyl just after the accident, and when he returned, he said that he'd observed an epidemic of stress-related disease. This was about 1990. And this stimulated the World Health Organization's Regional Office for Europe to convene an expert group discussion on the subject. And that led to a much better understanding of what was causing it. Actually, it was really quite simple. That it was actually a symptom of lack of trust in the competent authorities to protect the public health. It had many dimensions, but I don't need to go into the details of those. So if trust could be maintained, then the psychosocial effect has no need to take place at all. But it is wider than just trust in the immediate authorities, because there are several figures within the community who people generally trust, like doctors or politicians, maybe, or teachers. And these people really need to be educated to understand what the effects of radiation are, because people might go to a doctor, for example, and say, well, I have this symptom. Do you think it's due to Chernobyl? And the doctor says, well, yes, I think it might be, out of ignorance. When that's not true, that is undermining the trust in the doctor's diagnosis. So trust is really the most important thing. People need to be honest. And we saw in the case of the Chernobyl accident that the Soviet authorities denied, first of all, that there had been an accident, and then changed that view a little bit later to say, well, yes, there had actually been an accident, but it was a very small one. And then the full consequences came to be understood by the population, and they realized that they had been misled, and they then no longer trusted the authorities, and the psychosocial effect was initiated. So after the accident, the United Nations authorities, stimulated largely by the economic effects of the accident, the trading of foodstuffs. Some countries refused to take food from countries which they thought it might have been affected, be contaminated. And so the IAEA took the lead in setting up two conventions, which I have referred to before, the Early Notification Convention and the Assistance Convention. And the general idea behind that was to respond to accidents in a way that didn't raise people's fears. And that was really by telling them the truth about what was happening and telling them how they could avoid exposure. And the European Regional Office of WHO saw that as an opportunity to act to minimize the potential for the psychosocial effect. And so the European Regional Office took the role of coordinating the national emergency response centers in respect of public health, with a project office that I ran in Helsinki for 4 years, in collaboration with the Finnish Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority, STUK. Unfortunately, the decision was made to close that office in 2000, and we were never called upon to actually respond to an accident. And there was no replacement of that facility within WHO in time for the Fukushima accident. So when it came to March 2011, the IAEA was supposed to have responded immediately as soon as it was notified that there had been an accident. But in fact, that didn't happen until at least the 14th of March. So that was 3 to 4 days after the accident. And that was a major failing of the UN system, as I've said earlier today. It didn't start to operate, and even when it did start to operate, it didn't provide true information. It didn't mention the releases for quite several days, although it was quite clear from what we heard this morning that people were aware that there were radioactive plumes traveling across the country. So, notwithstanding these two legally binding conventions, the system failed. And actually, it puts in doubt some 20 years of work that has been done since Chernobyl. The Finnish system did work, and it used its website to communicate with the public, and there was such a tremendous interest that the website crashed due to over-subscription. So, yesterday I presented the evidence that doses below 100 millisievert carry the same risk per sievert as those above 100 millisievert. The UNSCEAR report, while not actually claiming a threshold, is certainly not clear on this issue. And UNSCEAR presented their own press release saying that cancers were unlikely to follow. However, their report gives data on both doses to workers and to the public, which shows that that is not true. And in fact, we could expect, just from the first 18 months of exposure to the most heavily exposed workers, some 50 excess cancer cases. So there again, we have an example where the public are not being told the truth. And it's an enormous disappointment to me that this issue of the 100 millisievert has not been resolved by Japanese scientists with whom I've worked in the past. They know for sure that the risk below 100 millisieverts is not zero. And it is therefore misleading, and it is fueling the psychosocial effect to indicate to people that it is. So I don't take sides in this debate, pro and anti-nuclear, because actually I'm a referee in the disputes that occur as to whether something is a consequence of the accident or not. IAEA is not in that neutral position because it has a mandate to promote the use of nuclear energy. And it is itself responsible for some of the psychosocial effects. And yet, they know that if they could, as they claim, make people fully happy with the activities of nuclear facilities and with the possibilities that there is an accident, they've had 30 years to persuade the general public that their industry and their technology and their competence is safe to operate without damaging the public health. And they failed to do it, and that's very clear as a result of what is happening here in Japan right now. So we should regard the psychosocial effect as an objective effect of radiation exposure and treat it on the same level as we treat cancer. It's not an irrational failure of the exposed population to resist the effects of radiation exposure. It's a natural consequence of not being told the truth when the situation where they might be exposed arises. Thank you for your attention.